Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. We're happy to have you all here on this Friday morning for our panel, which we hopefully have aptly titled Not the Usual Suspects, Engaging Male Champions of Women, Peace, and Security. I'm Gwen Young, and I direct the Global Women's Leadership Initiative here at the Wilson Center. And our focus is on women in government, all sectors of government, and across political and policymaking positions. So it's an honor for us this morning to have a distinguished panel that can talk about the role men and women play in peace and security and in bringing sustainable governance to countries. I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Milan Verveer, who happens to run the Women, Peace, and Security program at Georgetown and also is on the board of the Women in Public Service Project, and I have the distinct honor to work with. And Ambassador Verveer, we welcome you once again to the Wilson Center, and we're going to let you kick off this rich panel and rich discussion. Thank you all for coming.
Is this on? Thank you so much, Gwen, and it's always good to be here at the Wilson Center. And you're right, I like the adjective rich panel because we have a wealth of experience up here to really grapple with this very important topic. In many ways, it's an auspicious time to be doing this. I don't know how many of you know, but I presume a lot of you are experts on this issue. But this was the week in which the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 became law, coming out of a bipartisan Congress with significant leadership, obviously, and commitment on both sides of the aisle, both houses, and it is now law. And I think that gives us that much more hope and reason to hope that we can actually make even greater progress, having the United States recognize that women have a crucial role to play in all aspects of peace and security, peacekeeping, negotiations, the military sector, and the myriad ways in which that is executed. And it means that the United States will ensure that women's meaningful participation in this area will take place through our various ways in engaging in our diplomatic work, in our work at the Pentagon and beyond around the world, in our work and development that USAID, for example, does on the other side of this building. So this is a very significant new possibility, but its implementation will be the crucial factor. We know many laws are passed, many laws are not really vigorously implemented or enforced. And a lot of that will depend on leadership across government, leadership in civil society, and certainly leadership among all of the folks who are involved in this arena and beyond, which is one of the reasons this is an important topic. How do we engage men, recognizing men are still the dominant decision makers in all of the areas that this issue affects. A few years ago, this man to my left, I and others were involved in putting together the United States National Action Plan. That was an executive order at the time that President Obama promulgated that, again, said that we would, when we look at the work that we do in our diplomacy, in our military work, in our development work, that we would adopt a lens, a gender lens in that work, and enhance women's participation, recognizing that, yes, it was the right thing to do, but it was the smart and strategic thing to do. It remains that, and it is about our effectiveness. It is about our executing our missions. And some 67 countries today have national action plans. NATO has a national action plan. Some are vigorously pursued, vigorously acted on through policies and programs some are languishing. So again, leadership makes an enormous difference. And a lot of this work stems from the work that the United Nations started in the Security Council when it passed a resolution number 1325, linking the agency of women to peace and security in all of the areas that represents. It is particularly wonderful representing the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security to be here with our leader calling us together at the Wilson Center, and to be here with our friends who are shortly going to tell us about their new research from our Secure Future. Progress has not been what it should be on this issue. I just need to say that very directly. There has been some progress, good progress, movement in a forward direction, but it's frankly been slower than it should be. And that's another reason that today's topic is so critically important to how we go forward. We have with us a group of people, organizations, leaders who have been engaged on this issue. They bring a wealth of experience from different perspectives, and hopefully it won't just be talking the talk here today, but we will actually talk about concrete ways in which we can move this agenda forward based on the work that they have done, the perceptions they've had, the experiences, and what they recommend going forward. So let me briefly introduce them to you. I think all of you have bios. Some of their bios could go on for pages, so I will refrain. But let me start with my extreme left. Tim Shand is the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at Promundo. He previously worked as the Director of International Programs for the South African NGO and with other international organizations. Promundo has done some of the most seminal work of engaging men, which you'll hear about today, from the perspective not just that it's important to advance women in this space, to ensure their participation, but that it is life-changing for men and they become beneficiaries of this work in a significant way. Next to him is Jolynn Shoemaker, and she is here with our Secure Future. She's a consultant and writer on gender equality and issues that are related to all of this work. But the most important reason that we're pleased she's here is because she's been deeply engaged in the research that will be described very, very shortly. Next to her is Ambassador Stephen Magan. He is now heading up the consulting group, the Stevenson Group, but he has had a long career in the Foreign Service. He was ambassador not to Fiji, but not just to Fiji, but so many other islands in the South Pacific. He has had extensive experience in zones of conflict on some of the issues, some of the areas that are still in peace processes, but not really making progress in those processes, so those conflicts can blow up at any time. And the fact that before he left government, the last position before he went into his current role was at National Defense University, which again provides him with that perspective. How do you discuss these issues in the context of the training that goes on at NDU? And then our co-host, Sahana Dharmapuri, is the director of our Secure Future program at the One Earth Future Foundation. She has been a real leader on these issues in many, many institutions, and I'm going to let her start as soon as I finish these introductions with describing for you what this research has represented and what some of the outcomes and findings have been. And lastly, but by no means last in any way, Ambassador Donald Steinberg was most recently, and I worked with him very, very closely when we were putting together the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. He was the Deputy Administrator of USAID. He's a former ambassador. He got religion, should I say, on this issue in his diplomatic life, some real lessons that have stayed with him and in which he has acted on ever since. And he is currently the CEO of the World Learning Organization and president of the School for International Training that World Learning operates. So that's just a very, very brief snapshot of these extraordinary people. I'm going to try and stay quiet now and turn it over to them. Sahana, if you'll start us, and then Jolynn come in to the discussion in ways that are appropriate to your description of the findings.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting us, and to all of our panelists for joining us for this conversation. It's one that we're very excited about. So we began this study actually not with the question, do men matter to women, peace, and security? We understood how crucial and understand how crucial men's leadership is on moving the women, peace, and security agenda forward. What we were really struck by in our work in other projects and other across various sectors is that there were always side conversations and burbling ups, percolation of how are men engaging with women, peace, and security. Oh, this person over here was a real champion and he did this, and this person over here really was behind the scenes, but he really made things work and pushed the agenda forward in new and interesting and powerful ways. And we were interested in who are those people, what are they doing, what has been the challenges to these men to be engaged, and how did they get involved in the first place? We stepped back from our own understanding of women, peace, and security as a redefinition of security, as a new approach to understanding how to achieve peace and security, because we didn't want to ask leading questions. We really wanted to hear from the men's experiences and their perspectives about what are the challenges they're facing, what are the entry points they see, what are some strategies they might be considering, and what might have worked for them. And I think the key finding that was the most surprising to us was that across the board, across military, diplomacy, development, in the field, in Washington, the almost unanimous view that working on women, peace, and security has transformed the way that these men in leadership positions view what security is was the most striking. And they were very vocal about that. I think also their understanding that initially their work in women, peace, and security, they were considered sort of the targets of advocacy, but the roles have shifted into changing into advocates and bridge builders. And I think Jolynn will say more about that. The overall report, we will have the full report available next week, which has a lot more richness and detail in terms of personal experiences and recommendations. But you do have the shorter policy brief in front of you. You will find, as we found, that there are no straightforward answers. It's a very complex and nuanced place that we're in right now in trying to understand what are the roles of men and women in terms of advocating for this issue and growing the pool of champions. Jolynn, would you like to step in with?
Sure thing. Oh, I don't need to press anything. Okay. We wanted to actually take a couple minutes to tell you all sort of how we did this study too, because the question's been coming up frequently. So we interviewed between 50 and 60 men, and we did a smaller survey of about 25 internationally. We chose to conduct this study with participants from across sectors and countries. And we also identified them based on the recommendations of peers who are active within the women, peace and security, and gender equality communities. So we made a purposeful decision not to choose interviewees or participants based on those who are tasked with certain portfolios or those at certain ranks. As a result, we started with a much smaller list of about 20-25, and then as we started talking more in depth with men that we talked to, they then recommended others, and then other advocates, deeply involved advocates in this field recommended others. So we ended up with a higher number, and it's an indication, I think, that this agenda is reaching more people, and that there are more opportunities to be involved and interest to be involved. Most of our interviewees and our survey respondents had really only been active within the women, peace, and security community for about 5 years. So that also indicates that that it is gradually reaching more, and there are more opportunities to participate. As Sahana mentioned, we are kind of in this gray space right now. We have a architecture of mandates in place on women, peace, and security and related gender equality goals in the peace and security space, the UN level, other international organizations, and the U.S. government, due to the tremendous work of Ambassador Steinberg and Ambassador Verveer here. And then building on that, we now have a U.S. law that was recently passed. But really, in the advocacy community that has been working on this agenda for a long time, men have more often been the targets of our advocacy. So sort of how do we convince the men? Men are still sitting in the most prominent and dominant positions in peace and security. And now we're in this space where we're still trying to do that, yet at the same time, we have more and more men who themselves are becoming advocates and experts on gender equality. And so kind of how do we utilize and how do we move forward from this juncture? And the mandates and the guidance and the policy direction and all of this that has been built provides this structure and this opportunity. And what our participants said is it has provided more ways to come into the conversation. But there's still a struggle about how to best participate in that conversation among the men we talk to. So a couple of things we wanted to highlight, and we have some recommendations that came out, and we can talk about those, but we really want to hear from our other panelists from their experience. But this won't be surprising. Men who speak about these issues, it tends to be given more weight, more credibility. And so those we spoke with were conflicted about this, but said, perhaps the fact that there is a double standard and people do listen more when men speak about these issues is a strategic opportunity. And so we talked a lot about bridge building and how strategically advocates and organizations are increasingly asking men to come into the conversation, especially men who are coming from traditional security backgrounds, because it turns people's attention. They start to realize that this is an issue in the interest of our broader issues in peace and security. So really what we heard from those we talked to is the case has been made pretty strongly for this. It's a pragmatic strategy, a framework that makes sense. But really, how do we do it now? So we're moving on to the how. And there is so much potential for what real understanding and infusion of gender equality principles in our frameworks and institutions could do for peace and security. So as Sahana was saying, there is such transformational potential. And really, we were surprised to hear so much emphasis on that, and so much of a personal view that this can really change the world if we do it. And so a sense that this is mandates are so important. We've got to have them to bring people along, but we also have a much bigger task now. And so where we're moving is from the symbolic, from the high level, to how do we change individual viewpoints and actions and norms? And that is true both at the upper level, our institutions, our agencies, our decision-making structures that do big peace and security, to the ground level. And Tim knows full well and will talk about that work. And as we do it, and as we start to change the norms, how are we building this as a competency within peace and security? So that is definitely, things that came out very strongly. And one of the biggest obstacles that people identified across the board was their own organizations and the cultures, the embedded cultures within these organizations and leadership points of view, and the embedded gender blindness and gender bias that still exists. And how do you overcome that? And this is where it gets very gray, and the personal starts to mix in with the policy and the professional, where we talk to so many people who, when we ask these questions about how, they really got into these personal, life-changing experiences that had happened to them that really catalyzed the passion and the commitment to this. And then the policy stuff overlaid that, so that it combined together to make a very powerful force and incentive. So those are some of the things that we heard through our interviews, and we just very much look forward to this conversation and hearing from our distinguished co-panelists here.
Well, thank you both for kicking this off with that kind of broad scene setting, if you will. And at some point in this discussion, we want to bring you into it. As I look out, I see a number of people who've been very engaged in this space. So your comments, your questions will be very welcome. I want to turn next to Don, and maybe for the others of you, to start with, what in your experience really affected you profoundly to be engaged in this space, to understand why it's effective and what it makes a difference? And then maybe in the second round, we'll go into some solid solutions to moving forward. But how did you get motivated to be where you are today?
Well, I really started when I graduated high school. My dad and my mom, as a present, got me a lifetime membership in the National Organization for Women,
Wow.
which was great, except I really wanted a car. And I'm doing this with my kids. I have 2 boy preteens, and their allowance is $13.25. And they understand.
Wasn't your ATM code 1325 too?
Thanks, Milan. And they've come back to me and said, well, you care about children as well, and the 1620 was the children's resolution. Why not that one? So they're pretty smart. But really, the answer is that I've spent about 40 years working on peace processes and global development and atrocity prevention around the world. And I think the single lesson that I've learned most profoundly is that unless civil society and marginalized populations are brought into those processes, not just as beneficiaries, but as planners and implementers and leaders, the processes are very likely to fail. It is the single most important determinant of success or failure. And it's pretty obvious that that's the case. You need full ownership among local populations. You need the ground truth, in particular, that women bring to situations of health, education, but also the tough issues of national security. They change the dynamic in a room when you have, as we did in the Angolan peace process, 40 men sitting around a peace table. There's a certain testosterone in the room that is destructive to the peace process, and had we had a few women, at least in the room, we would have done a lot less posturing. I also would suggest that they simply change the agenda of issues that you discuss. And so you don't just discuss power. You discuss girls' education. You discuss accountability for abuses during the conflict. You discuss health and other related issues. And so what for me has come about from this experience is a recognition that women's empowerment is a national security issue. It is equally important, and I mean this quite seriously, as nukes in Iran or North Korea, as climate change, as international terrorism. These issues are key to America's national security. We look out and we see societies that are trafficking in drugs and people and weapons, that are sending off huge numbers of refugees, that are transmitting pandemic diseases, that are harboring terrorists and pirates. And the one single similarity between these societies is a lack of empowerment of women in particular. And what that has said to me in my career, and I've been fortunate to have a number of leadership positions, is that I need to fully incorporate gender considerations into everything that we're looking at, that this isn't a marginalized issue, that it isn't an issue that you throw in at the end and you have 6 different agenda items and this is the 7th. What it means very practically, and I'll finish with this, is that you apply what I call a 4-pillar approach. You, as a leader, you target programs specifically for marginalized populations, and it's women, but it's also people with disabilities and the LGBT community and indigenous populations and racial and religious minorities. And if you think about it, the groups I just mentioned represent probably 70% of society, so it's not like you're reaching out to special interests there. Secondly, you ensure that these issues are mainstreamed and integrated in everything you're doing. And so the program that we adopted at AID, where every single project had to have a gender impact statement to even be considered, is an important step. Thirdly, you need your organization to be a thought leader, an action leader, and learning leader, and a spokesperson for these issues. And then finally, you have to walk the talk within your organization. And I'll give you just one very practical example. I am CEO of World Learning. We have 2 major divisions. One is an academic division, one is our global development division. Both are headed by women. And I noticed that their titles were executive vice president. And that makes no sense. Why have vice president to a man who is CEO? And so what we did, very simply, was to change their titles. And they are both now presidents. And when they walk into a room, their card says President of World Learning and President of the School of International Training. I know it sounds symbolic. It's important. And then you extend that to all your employment practices. You extend it to your hiring, your promotion, who you reach out to do special projects, who you mentor, and you create an institution that walks the talk. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Don, let me just ask you, I want to go back to Angola for a second, because you went there, as I recall, and you were an observer for the United States of the peace process. I think you raised the question of why was it just 40 men at the table trying to bring the peace when they had been on either side of the combat. And then you come back not that much later as ambassador of the United States. And what did you see in terms of what had happened to that peace agreement?
The peace agreement was fundamentally flawed because of the lack of gender awareness. I remember having helped negotiate the agreement, as you say, and doing a press conference right before going out to be ambassador. And at the end, a journalist said, so, how does this affect women? And I said really proudly, there is not a single provision of this peace agreement that's discriminatory against women. Getting onto the ground, it took me about 3 weeks to realize that that was the stupidest statement you could possibly make. An agreement that calls itself gender neutral is in fact gender blind and is likely to fail. We had 40 men around the table, no women. We had a focus on amnesty right at the beginning, and that meant men with guns were forgiving other men with guns for crimes committed against women. We did not have provisions for psychosocial support for the victims. We had demobilization programs that sent men back to villages where, as someone was saying before, they had no role whatsoever because they'd been at war for so long. And so, in effect, what we were doing is leading to a new form, a more pernicious form of violence as the men beat their wives and had affairs and used drugs and alcohol as a means of reasserting their masculinity. And most importantly, when the process started to fail, we went to women's organizations and we said, could you help us? And they laughed at us. And they said, this isn't our process. This is the process for the men with the guns. There's no provision in here that reestablishes rule of law. There's no provision that holds anybody accountable. Let the thing fall apart and we'll try to put it back together again. And so the sad part is that after 3 years of no war, no peace, the country went back to war. And I do attribute it to a lack of civil society support for the process.
I think these experiences speak louder than a lot of other descriptions. Ambassador Magan, you've had an extensive career in this space as well, including in peacekeeping operations, in working with the Security Council on the implementation of some of the decisions there, the strategies, and in some very tough areas. And then, of course, ending with the time you spent at the National Defense University, how has this influenced you, and what has it meant for your own engagement, recognizing we need both men and women involved in this space, and it's clearly not just a women's issue?
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for those opening remarks. I always wanted to be Jon Meacham, and I'm a great fan of history. And Don allows me to begin my presentation by noting that in college and in graduate school, I was very much a student of the 19th and 20th centuries with a great deal of focus on the African-American civil rights movement and the women's movement. So I can actually point to Seneca Falls as the foundation, intellectually speaking, of my concern for these issues. Professionally, they began actually in 1989 when I was first assigned to our mission to the United Nations in New York, and I was assigned as the action officer and speechwriter to Ambassador Juliet McLennan, who was the first representative from the United States to be given the rank of ambassador by President George H.E. Bush as our ambassador to the Commission on the Status of Women. For 3.5 years, I worked closely with Judy promoting a resolution to increase the number of senior women at the United Nations. We had 43 co-sponsors to that resolution. Now, what I learned from that experience was that after close to 4 years of hard work, it resulted in no promotion. And as a Foreign Service officer, and there are a few of you out there in the audience, that really means a lot to us. It became clear to me that there was no institutional support for women's issues, human rights issues, environmental issues, or what have you, and that perhaps I was in the wrong place in the wrong time, so to speak. But I guess I'm a little hard-headed. As my career progressed, I wasn't discouraged by that, and when I became Deputy Director of the Office of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh from the period 2000 to 2002, at that time, our engagement in Afghanistan, as you well know, increased exponentially. And I found myself working on the creation of the Afghan American Women's Committee. It was one of the first times in my career in the State Department in which there were inklings of institutional support. That continued in my next assignment as Director for Asia and Near East in the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, where it became part of my portfolio to protect women and vulnerable populations. That was easy. But still, at the same time, I understood that there were still problems within the State Department concerning these issues. I always felt that whenever you walked into the room representing PRM Bureau, there was always this response. So tell me again why you're here. PRM Bureau, oh, that's right, you're our in-house NGO. There still seemed to be a lack of seriousness. But however, at the same time, we saw changes in the department. By the time I became Director of the Office for Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Island Affairs, the International Women of Courage Awards had been established. And in my watch in the Pacific, I was able to nominate 4 women from Fiji as a result of their efforts in the coup that had occurred in Fiji, and 3 were recipients of that award. But the difference is between when I was a junior officer working on the Commission and Status of Women and when I became a chief of mission as ambassador, both in Fiji in the Pacific and later in running our mission in Dili, Timor-Leste, was that I realized that I was able to start all my country team meetings by focusing on the fact that our job is to promote democracy, not to practice it. So therefore, the ambassador is interested in these issues. And as a result, we were able to do a lot in Suva on ending trafficking in women. I was able to have a very receptive USAID mission in Timor-Leste when I said, I think we should fund women's NGOs. By the time I left Dili, 4 had been funded and never had been funded before. So it became clear to me that in order to promote women's issues, we had to look in terms of, do you have the authority? What is the situation? And is it broader than just your own initiative? It's easy when you're a senior officer, and particularly an ambassador, to get things done. But unless you have widespread institutional support, nothing could happen. We have to clearly point to President Obama's executive order establishing the National Action Plan as a first step. If it wasn't for that executive order and subsequent orders by 2 Secretaries of Defense, that I was able to widen the aperture a bit at National Defense University to be able to convince the senior leadership of NDU that it was important to include women, peace, and security issues into the curriculum. I was able to do that not just alone, but because I had a team behind me. I know she's here. Naila Arnaz, for example, was an ardent supporter. It led to the establishment of a writing award on women, peace, and security at NDU, which still exists. I was able to convince the leadership to allow me to teach an elective seminar on women, peace, and security. But the interesting thing happened as soon as I left. Yes, the writing award remains, but suddenly there was no funding for the elective seminar. So it becomes clear that if we're going to continue to promote these issues, that we have to understand that they have to be situational. That is, will they work in this particular environment? And two, they must be sustainable. In order to be viewed as sustainable, they have to be embraced by the institutions, by government, and civil society in order to affect this change. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Oh, that was excellent, and particularly your representation of what it means to be in leadership positions to really make a difference once you're in them, of course, disposed to making the right decisions. But the other point I wanted to say to you is the U.S.-Afghan Council still exists, and we should have you come back as a member, given your role in this. But thank you for that. That was very, very helpful in setting the scene here. So we're going to go from diplomats and people engaged in trying to solve conflicts to the civil society sector and an organization, Promundo, that has been really focused on engaging men in a very significant way on important issues. But before Tim speaks, can we run a film of some of the work here to sort of set the scene?
njye nkiri mutoya hari igihe numvaga kuba umukobwa ari icyaha, noneho umugore yakoraga iby'umugabo amutegetse.
Imyumvire y'icyo gihe n'ishingirwa hariho ibintu byo kuvuga ngo iyo ubyaye umwana w'umukobwa bikunze kugenda bisenya ingo.
Byaye mbyara umukobwa, nkurikije inkurikizi w'umukobwa, numva noneho nanjye kibaye ikibazo. Noneho umugabo nawe nyine akanyereka ko umwana w'umuhungu nyine amushimishije, nkanabibona pe.
Naje ku icyo gihe mbega nari umuntu ukunda inzoga cyane, kugeza ubwo mbaye imbata yabyo, noneho bya bindi byose birarangiye. Tereza bimfashijemo, uwo twashakanye, yakunze kubona amahugurwa, bituma aranyerekaga icyerekezo cyiza, avuga ati hano ubuzima turimo bushaka gutera imbere. Biramfasha cyane kuri iyo nama, yaramfashije.
Ntabwo bahinduka kimwe, hari abavuga ngo naramuroze, hari kubera mbese uburyo yabonaga turi kumwe, ariko abana mu rugo
kugeza ubwo mbaye imbata yabyo, noneho bya bindi byose ni umuntu ubasha kwihanganira ikibazo kimubayeho. Bimwe mu byo namukundiye nicyo kirimo.
ubundi kubera intambara yabaye muri 1994 harimo abana benshi babaye imfubyi, ubwo rero niyo jenoside. Noneho nuko ntigo babwiye ko bashaka gusa umuntu w'umubyeyi babona ugira impuhwe wabasha kugira ngo azajya bitaho.
Bajya gutora Tereza kugira ngo abe mama wabo, ni ibintu byadutunguye.
Niba ari uko byagenze, ati none se ndakubuza, mbona byakiriye neza, nta kibazo afite. Muri ubwo buryo rero nanjye nabonye mba nkunda abantu, n'iby'imirire tukajya tujya kubigisha guteka, tubigisha uburyo bateka kugira ngo nuko barera barumuna babo. Ariko noneho n'aba nanagiye agasigara no ku rugo, baza bahagera akabakira nk'umupapa wabo, ukabona mbese abana barisanzuye.
bigaragara rero ko iyo hataza kubaho imyumvire yanjye kuri njye ngo nakire cya gitekerezo Tereza bariho bazamuka bitewe n'uko bakora.
Ufite umukobwa we mu buhe buryo? Nyamara n'umukobwa wanjye umva ni ibintu nawe bimushimye kuba yarahindutse, bifite umusaruro ushimishije.
Grateful very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Ambassador Revere, and a great privilege to be on the stage with people who have shown such great leadership in terms of women, peace and security and women's rights. Just a word about my own personal story. I began working as a student in a rape crisis centre, and one of the kind of humbling experiences for me, of course, was working in a rape crisis centre with the vast majority of people who receive support, of course, being women, and rightly so, particularly given the context, really understanding and seeking guidance from women in terms of the role that I could or should play. And one of the key questions that they had at that point was, well, how do we see violence against women, rape, to not just be seen as a women's issue? Why is it that when we go to speak in communities where we're pigeonholed, as I think the women, peace and security agenda often is just being about women's rights and not about human rights? Why is it that women's bodies, are seen as an issue of concern only for women? And so that really took me on a journey of trying to explore, well, why is it that men often don't see themselves as gendered? Why is it that the field of gender often is seen as only about women? And how do we understand that men themselves are gendered? Men are gendered both in terms of the gendered socialization of what it means to be a man and the impact that has on women in terms of their relationships, in terms of their violence and their engagement in household chores or support for their broader financial activities or women's economic empowerment, as you saw in the film. What does it mean for men's involvement in their families and their relationship with their children? And importantly, what does it mean for men themselves, and what do we lose out on in terms of the way in which gender norms are structured, the ways in which we are gender blind in terms of men's own genderedness? And I know, having become a father myself, that it's been a really humbling experience reflecting on my own upbringing and my own relationship with my father and my parents, but my father particularly, and thinking about how I hope to play a role in the lives of my own children in terms of the gendered socialization processes. So I've been kind of thinking and working on this issue for a long time, and I undertook some research in the Democratic Republic of Congo together with Promundo, not working for Promundo but in partnership with, and we were doing something called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, which is a global survey that we've now implemented in over 30 countries, Images for short, which is the kind of pioneering research in terms of what do we know about men's attitudes, behaviors and practices across a range of issues, including violence, but also childhood, health, their understanding of women's rights or support or lack of, and what do women say about men's behaviors and practices and women's own experiences and views. And one of the really interesting things that resonated for me in the work in the DRC, and that really has been very influential to my own involvement in the women's peace and security sector, was we often think of conflicts and post-conflict settings importantly, but often around how does it impact on women, and how does rape, and which is used often increasingly as a tragic weapon of war, how does it destroy women's lives and communities' lives? But we often don't look at, outside the context of rape, what kind of society are women, or the context of war, sorry, what kind of society are women living in? And we found very high levels of, particularly in these patriarchal contexts, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. We found very high levels of rape-supportive attitudes. But we also found men themselves struggling with what it meant to deal with the trauma of war, a little bit relating to what Ambassador Steinberg has just said. So men coming back from being combatants, being involved in war, being a warrior, that being their identity, returning to communities with the stresses of how do I fulfill, how does my community respond to me in terms of my role as a man and my responsibilities to be a provider. So huge levels of economic stress, but also huge challenges around mental health, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and of course, as a result of that, significant restrictions on women's rights and women's ability to speak up and use their own voice, but also use of violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence. And so one of the arguments I really want to make is that the ability to put women at the table, the ability to ensure that women's rights are reflected and that women are speaking up on their own behalf, and we don't have a scenario of 40 men making a decision. We really have to think about what happens in the home and the community around them. And I think, those traditional forms of masculinity, we've also done a report in the US, the UK, and Mexico recently called the Man Box, which I'd be happy to share, which finds that these traditional forms of masculinity are alive and well here in our own country as they are elsewhere. But they really have an impact on women's bodies and on women's lives and on men's lives. And in particular, our lack of focus on how men deal with trauma, how men deal with the impact of war, how men deal with the impact of being sexually abused and being raped sometimes themselves, how that then leads to their future behaviours in terms of their relationship with their partner, their relationship with their children, as I say, and more broadly, is very rarely spoken about and even less frequently kind of addressed. And so two things that I just want to share with you in terms of the work that we are doing is one, through an initiative called Living Peace, which was built off the research in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the findings that I mentioned. We're working with men and women and the communities and the police and the military through a process of dealing with the trauma and the healing around war and conflict, and the first time for many of these men actually to talk about their own experiences of violence and rape, and then working through relationships and gender equality. So an entry point around men's own experiences, but then thinking about what it means to be equitable in your relationships. Actually, how you benefit by the fact that if you share power with your partner, if you are more supportive of women's access to economic opportunities. Then thinking about how the violence that men themselves have perpetrated has had a big impact on their own lives and on their partners' lives, of course, and how they themselves should be held accountable for their own use of sexual violence and the impact of that. But then using that as a transition to think about, well, how do we prevent violence and what does violence prevention look like? And then what action should we take at the community level? And we've had really tremendous results in terms of, and we've got rigorous evidence on this, that the change in men's lives in terms of the respect that they have for themselves, which has significantly increased, and then their ability to then respect others, to respect their partner, to respect their children more, to respect their communities. A lot of, particularly in Rwanda, so the film was a story a true story around a couple who worked with children who were orphaned as a result of the genocide. And one of the big challenges that we will know, many of you better than I do, that in the context of war and conflict, not only is rape used as a weapon of war against women, but you have a huge amount of stigma related to that. So women returning to communities often have huge problems around acceptance by their partner, acceptance by their broader communities, but you have high levels of orphaned children, or children orphaned or children from as a result of rape who are equally stigmatized and not accepted. So we were able to see shifts in men's support for their partner who had been raped, as well as their greater willingness to engage with and support the children that were a result of rape in the context of war. And we saw reductions in use of alcohol amongst men. We saw greater sharing of household tasks. We saw improvements in gender equality. We saw reductions in violence. We saw men's greater support for economic empowerment, as I say. But we also saw broader effects in the community. The men who no longer would drink the way that they would with their friends who weren't part of our intervention, then they slowly changed their behaviors. Others in the community started to talk about how the behavior changes were good for everyone. So change is possible. Prevention does work. It doesn't take a generation. We can change over a very short period of time, and I would encourage us to think about how we invest in that. And of course, women need to be at the center of decision making, but I think we need to understand how conflict and war has gendered impacts for both women and for men, and how the healing process and the challenges as a result of that both require gendered, nuanced responses to that, and that implications of not dealing with that are an increase in violence, an increase in lack of ability for women to access the public space, and that we can build more peaceful and safer communities as a result.
Thank you very much. And, so much of what you said went back to what Jolene had said at the outset from the study about the need to change norms, which may be the hardest thing to do, mindsets, norms, behaviors, and you really went right at the heart of that in your remarks. We're going to do one more round here in terms of concrete solutions, recommendations, what we should be doing to be more effective in this space, and then we'll turn it over and bring the audience into the conversation. So, Don?
A whole lot to say based on the
You have
the
a
comments.
limited amount of time.
Well, I'm gonna cheat and use as much as I can. So the picking up on Tim's point, one of the most exciting things we did at USAID was to fund organizations like Permundo and like others that were doing this work. And I remember going to visit one of the projects with our good friend Claudia Paz in Guatemala, in Nabaj. And it was a group of rural women in this small village who had finally said enough is enough. And they essentially organized themselves. A lot of them had never gone to school, but they petitioned the local governor, they petitioned the local mayor, they organized strikes and boycotts, and it changed the dynamic in this village, which had been faced with tremendous sexual violence, and up until about 8 years ago, domestic violence was considered under the law a traditional practice. It was not a law. It was not a crime. So I went to talk with this group, and we went over lunch, and about 3/4 of the way through, one man in the back of the room stood up, and he said, "You've heard their story. I want to tell you my story." He said, "I came from a traditional Guatemalan family. My dad used to get his paycheck on Fridays, used to get drunk and come home and beat my mom." And it went on and on throughout my childhood. I watched it. I was a young kid. I was powerless to do anything about it. I felt disenfranchised. I felt demasculinized. And so when I grew up and I got married, I started beating my wife. And he said it almost matter-of-factly. And he said I went on and on and on. And then my wife asked me to come to this organization and talk with people. And I saw the impact that domestic violence had on these women. I heard their stories in a way that I couldn't even hear it from my own wife. And he said, 4 months ago, my wife gave birth to a baby boy. And I looked down at the boy, held him in my arms, and I said, enough is enough. This pattern stops with me. And he said that he would never engage in domestic violence, that it had transformed his life. And to me, that is the practical case for the kinds of initiatives that you've been talking about. More specifically, I think it's really important for us to continue as policymakers and as leaders to present the argument that involving women is not only, as you said, the right thing, but it's the most efficient and effective thing. And I speak a lot to groups of United Nations police commissioners and military commanders and SRSGs. And they're almost all men. We know that. And you start off by trying to tell them that they have a legal mandate in 1325, and the resolution that they are going to be doing their peacekeeping operation from probably has a provision on women, peace, and security, and their eyes glaze over. And then you say to them, well, you know, this is only fair. Women have suffered so much in the context of the war, and their eyes stay glazed. You then talk about, you know, this could be your wife, your mother, your daughter, your aunt, and the twinkle starts to appear. But the only time you get them really interested is when you say, you know, you're going to have a failed peace process, and the future of your career is going to be permanently damaged by the fact that you've been associated, as in my case, with an Angolan peace process that failed. Then they start to perk up. And you give very specific examples. So you say, you know, peace processes fail because they're ceasefire violations. Who are you going to ask about the ceasefire violations? You're going to ask the people in the room, the military commanders? They're not going to tell you anything. Go into the marketplace. Talk to the women whose lives depend upon having information about when they're going to have to flee their village. You want to know if your vaunted disarmament process is working and demobilization? Don't talk to the people who are running it. Go into the villages to which these people are being sent and see whether they're beating their wives and engaging in domestic violence and all of that. You want to know if your security sector reform is working? Don't ask the military commanders. Ask the people in the village whether they will go to the army or the police to complain about a human rights violation, or is it the police and the military the ones who are conducting the human rights violations? And then people start to get it, and they can start to see the connection between the success of a peace process and the failure of a peace process. I do want to say that in Angola, it never really reverted to full civil war, in part because we had learned the lessons. And I will always be grateful for the Women's Refugee Commission that came out in the middle of my tour there and said, look, Don, we could embarrass you publicly, but we're going to talk to you privately. You're blowing it. You are not involving women in distributing assistance. You're not building women's civil society groups. You don't have an emphasis on girls' education, et cetera. And we started to switch, and we started to move along. And I attribute the fact that it never went back to full civil war in part to that. And therefore, it was a real privilege for me then to become the first male board member of the Women's Refugee Commission, which was great. Two other very quick things, if I could. One is we have to involve men. Look around this group. I have a rule that I call 85%. Every audience I ever speak to on gender and women, armed conflict, is 85% women. Thank you for coming. I really do appreciate it. I wish we'd have more than 10 men in this room right now. And we've got to figure out how to do this, recognizing that the title was focused on men, and we still have this dynamic. And try this when you go to an issue that talks about gender. It's almost always 85%, and here it's 10 out of 66. 85%. Interesting. The last point I want to make is you don't have to be a woman to understand these challenges. I have been an advocate for disability rights all of my life. And it's been a really heavy emphasis of mine. About 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I shake a lot. And I'm now part of the community. And I am writing right now an essay on how my perspective has changed on the issue of disability being part of the community. I don't believe I need a sex change operation in order to be able to write on my role in women's promotion.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Steve?
Thank you for the opportunity to make a few additional comments. You know, earlier on we talked about the importance that men can play in helping to affect change. And I did give a couple examples of what I did personally as an ambassador. But I do think that we have to look beyond just the role of men in particular and the importance of executive orders and legislation. One of the things that was really important about how I was able to affect change at NDU was the war in Afghanistan. 3 members of senior leadership had served in Afghanistan, and they had an acute understanding of the role that women played in that society. More importantly, and 2 of these men were Marines, they really understood the significance of the U.S. female engagement teams that were sponsored by the Marine Corps. These female engagement teams not only saved American and Afghan lives, they demonstrated that women were able to go into combat situations, play an effective role, and achieve mission outcomes. It was these women who were able to affect the thinking of the men in senior leadership. It was the roles that they played that made the female engagement teams in Afghanistan important for our own operations. And that was then translated back home at NDU into, oh, this is something we can support. So let's not move away from the fact that the progress that was made in the U.S. military concerning the role of women was initiated by women. It was not a top-down situation. So we can't separate the two of those things. And which is why I think it's always important at a certain stage, be it in the Department of State, USAID, Treasury, as well as the Department of Defense and within the combatant commands, that we have to change the language. We have to move away from visionary, gender-based language to operational, mission outcome, effectiveness, efficiencies, in order to understand that there is a significant role to be played by incorporating these elements, and not that we're doing this out of some sense of self-satisfaction or being gender proper. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
This is a great conversation. Thank you. So one of the initial remark and then a couple of concrete suggestions. So, you know, I think one of the things that's important for us is that the work around engaging men in women, peace and security, or engaging men in conflict and post-conflict most broadly, came out of the request from women, from women's rights organisations, from grassroots feminist organisations, saying, you know, people continue to come into our town, come into our refugee camp, come into our IDP camp, you know, and you only ever speak to the women. You never speak to the men. And so I do think that, you know, we're an organisation of more female staff than men. One VP, our other VP is a female. I've spent most of my life working in organisations where I've been probably one of the few men and working with organisations mainly staffed of women. So I think it's important to say that yes, the 85% rule is an important one, but I think, you know, we're all women can be advocates for men's involvement just as women can be men can be advocates for women's rights. And so I would love to see more men here, but not to in any way kind of discourage the women that are here and to continue to promote this work, because ultimately it's about human rights, it's about everyone. And I think related to that, the tension that you picked on your report is kind of interesting in the sense that I do think we have to be careful that we don't, and we talked about this briefly in the morning, but we don't kind of see men as heroes or champions because they come forward and say, hey, I'm a man supporting women's rights or women, peace and security. Of course, we should acknowledge the tremendous work that they do, and I think that's important. But I think we also have to be careful, as I was saying this morning, you know, my wife sometimes says to me that, you know, yeah, it's great you come home and, you know, you look after our child in the evening and you kind of want to be seen as a hero for doing that. But, you know, I'm just a parent, you know, I'm just getting on with being a mother. So, you know, I do think that we have this kind of inherent double standard, and I'm grateful to my wife for, not always, but sometimes, most of the time I'm grateful to my wife for kind of putting me in place. And as we were laughing about this morning, for saying, well, shut up and clean the toilet. And so, kind of three concrete suggestions in terms of, four, sorry, if I may, in terms of what we might do. So I think firstly I think this is part of changing the conversation. So I think we recognise that men are in positions of leadership and decision making. It's not that men don't have power; men do have power, but it's that men don't see themselves as gendered, and they see often this field as gendered equals women, and you know, I'm not affected by it. You know, why is this? Why are we talking so much about women's rights? So I think a challenge for all of us to not just think about men's role in supporting women's leadership, but men's role in changing the conversation around gender. Gender is about human rights. It's about transformation. You know, it's about highlighting that, as we had also heard from a comment this morning, those working in women, peace and security aren't every day thinking about all the women in Africa. They're thinking about human rights. They're thinking about how everybody benefits and transforms. So we need to shift our understanding of gender, and that it's not about a lack of men at the table. It's that men are often not at the table for the right issues, and I think the 85% comment is a good reflection of that. So secondly, I would pitch in relation to what I said about men dealing with their own trauma in conflict and post-conflict is how do we understand or reformulate what we believe is secondary prevention. So clearly we need primary prevention, but secondary prevention often is solely around the legal response and holding men to account, which I think is really important. But I've often in my work heard women say, I want the violence to stop, but I don't want the relationship to stop. I've had other researchers say, if we locked up every single man that perpetrated violence against women or committed rape or sexual assault, our prisons would be even fuller than they are, and in fact our prison system wouldn't be able to cope. And notwithstanding the fact that prisons in and of themselves, are often not a great place for rehabilitation. But so how do we understand secondary prevention? And so I want to propose that, secondary prevention is about psychosocial support, is about working with men as well as women, but it's about helping people to deal with the trauma and the impact of violence. We see more and more research relating to what Ambassador Steiner has said, that and we found that within our work, and it's more conclusively proven now, that men who witness violence or as a child or experience violence, they're much more likely, not directly always, but there's a greater likelihood that they may then go on to use violence. And so there's a cycle of violence. And so we don't really think about how do we prevent and stop that cycle of violence. So I think psychosocial support to address those root causes of violence, to think about the impact on men as well as women, on boys and girls, on communities, and really to deal with the impact, to get the support to men who may then go on to use violence. I think that's important in this context, and particularly important in conflict and post-conflict settings where you have especially patriarchal structures. So, and then thirdly, I think this is about the multi-level structural issue, and I think it is about recognizing that toxic masculinities are alive and well in individual communities, but they're also alive and well, as we've heard, in military institutions, in the police, in international NGOs, in the corporate sector, in the civil society sector. So how do we get men themselves to think about power, to think about patriarchy, to think about what it means to be a man, and to think about gender equality? And I think we have work to do, not only in the communities where we can see really transformational change, but also in institutions and structures. And I think part of it is about operational success. I agree, and I think it's partly also about saying that it's not just a deficit model, that changing society is transformational and it's going to be good for everybody. It's going to be great for women in terms of women's rights and in terms of empowerment, but it's also going to be good for men, and I think that's really important. And then lastly, just to talk about fatherhoods and the kind of the video that you saw. So I do think there are certain entry points that may or may not that can be often successful in working with men and working with families and communities. And the video was of our Men Care campaign. So we coordinate a global campaign called Men Care, which seeks to engage men and women around how to be more positive, non-violent, and caring parents. And part of what we want to do is to shift the care economy. We want, ideally 50% of the care work to be done by men. We know that we've got a way to go, but we know that not only is that good for men and for women, it will help to reduce the pay gap between men and women that we know is continues to be pervasive, and ultimately it will be better for families and communities in the long run. So there's 4 concrete ideas that we would put forward, and all of them are things that we're working on, and programs that we have, and research and evidence to back it up in terms of impact.
Great, thanks, Tim. Lots to think about. Any questions, comments? Let's start with you, sir. Right here.
Yeah.
The microphone.
She's coming.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. My name is Nizar Farsakh. I'm a leadership and advocacy trainer. And my question is to the panel, whoever wants to answer it, is on the most effective strategy you can think of in having the biggest impact. And I'm from the perspective of dealing with the government, so legislation and like structure, and then civil society and change it in order to grow from the bottom up. And I say that because we have different examples where, for example, in Eastern Europe, because there was a Marxist ideology, they had generations of men and women equality, so societies lived in those contexts. Or sometimes it's circumstantial. So in Palestine and in Iraq in the 80s, the men happened to be in prison or in the war front. So the boys grew up in households where competent mothers delivered on leading the family, and therefore when they became men in the 90s, it was normal for them, and they expected women to play those roles. Now these things have rolled back because the circumstances have changed, and now women are veiled, and I have friends who veil themselves in order to get better access to the judicial system and to do their research, and likewise Iranian directors who say, you know what, I'll wear the veil if that allows me to do my films, right? So I know it's a difficult question, but if you had $100 million to spend in 10 years, where would you start and how would you spend it when it comes to government, so structure versus the ground up? Thank you.
Okay, let's take 2 more and then we'll go through them. Sir, yes, with the hand up there.
I'm a Woodrow Wilson Fellow in Public Policy and International Affairs, ex-military. But as regards to my question, it relates to my work as an envoy in South Sudan. We probably have one of the most incredible wars that has gone on, and the viciousness and the intensity is like very few people have seen. And we're talking people who've been around with the breakup of Yugoslavia. And the sexual violence against women has been on a level that very few people have seen. In particular, I've been in the Sudan. We just came from South Sudan, and I was at the UN camp in Juba, and there's 20,000 women, and according to a survey done, there was at least 70% of the women have said they've been raped. So, given that kind of statistic, and this speaks to the kind of war that we've had, we do need men to be involved in this process to change such, we have this kind of thing going on. And I think, and I want to know what your opinion is, because my perspective is that role models are important, and we need men who are leaders and who have the political will. And I think that's what I'm hearing some of you say, but I think the political will, if you're going to be a leader, you need to have political will to make the necessary change. And in this kind of environment which we have in South Sudan, we need something, and I want to know what your perspective is. And I want to note also, I saw the film on Rwanda, but Rwanda is the #1 country that has more women in parliament than any other country. Mm-hmm. And there are four African countries in the top 10 that have high levels of women involvement. But I think you have to have, the leadership is important. I think political will speaks to that. So I'd like to know your perspective on that.
Okay, excellent. One more. Okay, back there. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Caroline Hubbard, Senior Gender Advisor at the National Democratic Institute. My question kind of links a little bit to the questions that have just been asked as well. I'm interested in whether or not there has been research on, or anyone on the panel can comment on, the impact of this trauma on men that become political leaders. We oftentimes will see armed groups actually transition from their militarized institution into the political party in power sometimes, or at least a dominant party in the new political structure post-conflict. And if we're saying that men experience trauma that then has an impact on how they treat women, including violence in their homes, what is this doing to how they create policies and how they set up these institutions and become these leaders that we need that are aligned with women's rights and gender equality? Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Let's take that one, and then we'll do them all.
Thank you very much. I really want to appreciate all the wealth of information that we just got. And my question is also on follow-up. My name's Angelina. I was leading the team, our team negotiating for the peace that has collapsed in South Sudan. And I was leading the security committee. As a woman on the table, my party was fighting for total demilitarization for South Sudan. I was arguing for at least a minimum for security sector reform. I was seen as an obstacle. I got no support. So we talk about putting women on the table, but what about supporting those women who are on the table?
Excellent question.
Thank you.
All right. Do you all take them down, or do I need to repeat them? All right, let's start. Well, let's start with Tim this time. As concrete and succinct as you can be.
Sure.
Because we are out of time,
Are we?
but we will answer all of these.
Great. So, great questions. Let me just take them in order that they were asked. So if I had $100 million, probably wouldn't be sitting here, but so I think we need to recognize we do have evidence-based, impactful interventions that do work, that are out there. I think we often, yes, we need more research, we need more investment, but we do. And so one I would put on the table is we've just finished a randomized control trial of an intervention working on maternal, newborn and child health with men and parents and partners and families. And we've seen really excellent results in terms of men's involvement in fatherhood, men's involvement in maternal and child health, reductions in violence in relationship, reductions in violence against children, improvement in couple decision making and relationships, men more involved in gender equitable roles within the household, and greater kind of gender equitable and women's rights, including economic empowerment. So I think we would love to take that kind of model and scale it up. I think the structural piece is how do you get these models into the national systems? You know, we've got models that work, but they're not necessarily embedded in public institutions. They're not embedded in policy frameworks that often gender equals women. So how do we scale those up and take them across countries, not just within particular communities? I think the civil society piece is really important. I think one of the things that we're seeing a breakdown in is a breakdown of feminist voices on the ground. And I think we need to really support grassroots feminist organizations to hold government accountable, to be part of the process. I think, you know, it is a big challenge right now. I think that we're seeing more and more funding going to big, large international NGOs and fewer funding streams going to the grassroots organizations. And so that's where I would put my money if I had it. South Sudan, so I think for me, it comes back to the point that you've got a context where 70% of women have experienced violence. And so we have to think beyond our more traditional approaches of legal responses solely. I think legal responses to hold people to account is critical, but what do you do in a society where basically everybody knows themselves have experienced or they know others who have experienced violence? And so I do think it's really critical that you then think through a process of working with women and men in terms of how to deal with that violence, how to go through psychosocial support, how to think about different and alternative roles. And the one thing I would say is that even in the midst of places like South Sudan, in the DRC, I showed you our video from Rwanda, but we've also got a DRC film and films from other contexts. There are men who are stepping up, who are behaving in equitable ways. It's not that, you know, it's only men who are using violence. It's only men who are being inequitable. There are men even in these, you know, terrible situations, and I think it's how do we support them, how do we shine light on them, but how do we also multiply them? And I think we do that, and we've got the models. But I agree, role models is important. But again, women often want the violence to stop, but they don't want the relationship to stop. And I think we really need to listen to the voices of women. I think I kind of touched on the structural elements in relation to that. And the last question was, sorry, obstacles. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
On political leadership.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really critical question. And what I was going to say, thank you, is just that's a gap in our evidence and our research. You know, we are able to speak to men and women in communities. We are able to speak to them within the military, within the police. But actually, it's really difficult to try and get men who are in positions of political leadership to engage. And it's something that we haven't done enough of. I think that as a sector, we haven't done enough of, and we need to try harder at. But it's also particularly difficult. But I absolutely agree. I think, you know, what does it mean in a society to set up services to deal with rape and trauma when you've got a government or an institution which is traumatizing its people? And so I think we need to think about that, you know, structural forces at a political level and engaging around that. And yeah, we'd love to continue that conversation, but it's a challenge.
Okay, great. Steve?
In answering that question, I think I would approach it slightly differently. Women, peace, and security is an immensely complex, complicated subject. Sometimes it's actually inherently contradictory if you put those three together. And it seems to me that if we're going to approach it, I would try and to divide this up differently. Put it in separate baskets. I think we need an advocacy basket. I think we need a basket that focuses on leadership. I think there's a basket about institutional culture and priorities because we just can't have one voice trying to address all three of these. And I'm sure there are probably something else that I forgot. And then we can build appropriate coalitions based on self-interest. All right, where is there a meeting of these areas? But I think what happens too often is that in the dialogue, it gets lost as to what is it that we're trying to achieve. All right, I'm not sure if I wanted to just focus on women and peace, and I'm really thinking about security, that's what I want to do. I think that if I'm focusing on security, I want the best person, woman, man, who can address these issues. I understand that there may be a predilection, which is different than an inclination, for women to look for a more peaceful solution to certain outcomes, but that in itself is not going to be the guiding point. So I think that, again, slicing and dicing this in a different way may help us achieve the goals. That's
Yeah, I had 4 quick points. The point on role models, I think, is essential. And there were 2 people who I pointed to at AID when I was deputy administrator who were leading the way. One was Carla Coppell, who is this remarkable gender advisor, gender coordinator, doing great things, etc. But the other, sitting in the back here, is Larry Sampler. Larry is a self-acknowledged alpha male, white, southerner, military approaches, and yet he was a closet feminist and recognized, and I'm sorry to out you here, but he understood in ways that none of us did the importance of women in particular in Afghanistan and Pakistan, et cetera. And to be able to point to Larry and say, you know, go talk to Larry about your concerns about us overemphasizing, you know, women, peace, and security in this agenda. The second thing I wanted to mention is the importance of tying requirements to performance in any of our organizations. And the one example I'll give there is we talked a lot about at AID including women, peace, and security into the performance evaluations. And you'd get the standard line, you know, the officer is really sensitive to gender considerations, and it was in every one. It didn't get taken seriously until we denied a very venerable aide mission director a new assignment as mission director by telling him, you are insensitive to these issues. And we let it be known quietly but publicly that that's why we had denied him the promotion. And it quickly spread, and you know, we could see in the very next exercise a real description of what people were doing. The question on the money, I had that challenge because I did have a lot of money at AID, and I'll give the simple answer, which is you just turn to Milan Revere and say, how should you spend it?
My husband says the same thing.
But I will give you one practical thing that we did. The very first thing I did at AID was to find $15 million to promote the participation of women in peace processes around the world. And I had the pleasure of announcing it at a FOD university in the great women's university in Khartoum. And what we did was to provide funding for training for women who were involved in peace processes at the local level, because in many of these societies they really are involved in that, in leading those exercises, providing them training to apply those same principles to the national process. And I remember talking with Betty Bagombe once about the fact that women in a Choli society are really in the forefront of leadership in their communities, and yet when you have the negotiations between the Lord's Resistance Army and the government, there are no women at the table. And so we did that. We provided them stipends so that they could provide for their children, because just because you're negotiating peace for your country doesn't mean your husband is going to take care of the kids. And perhaps most importantly, we provided them physical security, because we all know that the most dangerous profession in the world is a woman peacemaker. So I would want to extend those kinds of programs writ large. The last thing I wanted to say that only partially relates to what we've been talking about is the importance of intersectionality. We're focused on women here, but you take the marginalization of women then you add you're a displaced woman, then you add you're a minority displaced woman, add then disabilities, add then indigenous population, that 70% figure that you were citing turns into a 95% figure when you're talking about people who bring those intersectionalities together. So we can't ever forget the fact that the abuse is additive, it's almost multiplicative in these situations. I think I'll hold up there.
Well, thank you very much, and we kept you over, but I hope you think it was worth it. This is a conversation that has to go on, but not just as a conversation, but for those concrete steps we each need to take to bring about the kind of change that really matters. And yes, the title is Engaging Men on Women, Peace, and Security, but it's really the security of all of us, and it takes all of us. And I can't thank this wonderful panel enough for a really rich discussion, as you said, Gwen. So thank you all, and thank you for coming and for all that you do.